The Center for Philosophy of Religion presents the Free Will Defense. If God exists, God is perfectly good and all-powerful. But if God is so good, wouldn't he really want to prevent evil? And if God is so powerful, wouldn't he be able to do exactly what he really wants? Thoughts like these have led many to believe that it would be impossible for both God and evil to exist. But Alvin Plantinga has argued that they can coexist after all. Being all-powerful is impressive, but not even an omnipotent God can make a square with no corners or a rock too heavy for God to lift. Omnipotence gives God control over what is possible, not the power to do the impossible. Plantinga proposes that it is also impossible for God to ensure that we never use our freedom to bring about evil. But why? The answer depends on what is required for freedom. Part of what makes an action, say Jane's riding her bike, free, is that she is also able to do something else instead. If Jane is simply forced or caused by something else to ride her bike in a way that undermines her ability to do otherwise, then Jane's act isn't truly free. Accordingly, if God chooses to create a world with free creatures, he cannot guarantee that they always use their freedom in the right way. Any such guarantee would simply eliminate genuine freedom and also eliminate all the value freedom brings into the world. On Plantinga's view, God is responsible for the existence of the beings that possess free will and of their surroundings. But what comes of that gift of freedom is ultimately up to them, not God. At best, this shows only that God couldn't ensure that the world contained both free will and no evil. But couldn't God just create a world with neither instead? Perhaps the answer is that free will is a great good, a magnificent good. So incredibly good that the combination of free will together with the evil that accompanies it is more valuable than any world God could have created instead with no free creatures. Now, maybe that's not God's actual reason for permitting the kind of evil that arises from misusing freedom. And so we don't have what philosophers call a theodicy. We might not even be capable of knowing God's actual reason. Nevertheless, it is one possible explanation of how God and evil could both exist. And that's enough to serve as an adequate defense against that impossibility claim. Plantinga's free will defense. Still, we might wonder why God couldn't create only those people who would always freely do what is right. For Plantinga's answer to this surprisingly hard question, click here. To learn more about these ideas, please visit plantingavideos.com.
Brief introduction to Theodicy. And the next video, the second part there, is the Trans-World Depravity video, which you can look up on your own when you're home at plantingavideos.com. Theodicy. Today is our last message in our Introduction to Christian Apologetics series. Now, one of the purposes of delving into apologetics is to introduce the broad range of fantastic material and perspectives within the Christian community. Now, most of you are hearing for the first time about some of the most prominent Christian apologists, scientists, and philosophers, such as William Lane Craig, Ravi Zacharias, Hugh Ross, John Lennox, Alvin Plantinga, and Ian Barber, just to name a few. Now, during one of our sessions, I asked how many of you had heard of Lee Strobel, and 2 of you put your hands up. Well, there's a third and a fourth. And a fifth. All right. And, 6. Look at that. Some more hands. Great. Lee Strobel. His book, The Case for Christ, is a fantastic introduction to Christian apologetics, in which investigative journalist Lee Strobel interviews some of the most prominent Christian scholars in efforts to prove to his wife that Christianity is false. During this journey, he came to faith in Jesus Christ. Now, this book weaves that story together with some of the apologetic discussions that won him to faith. There are 20 copies in the lobby, so we invite you to please pick up a copy on your way out. We ask that you only take one per family. We don't have enough for all of our friends, etc. But if we fall short and you know of somebody who could really, really, really use that book, or for whatever reason, if you don't get one, we will order some more. Peterborough City Church is providing these books, so feel free to pick one up on your way out. They're a fantastic introduction to apologetics. So not only is the purpose of this introduction to apologetics to expose you to many of the great Christian apologists, but also to show how belief in God and in Christianity is intellectually, reasonably, scientifically, and philosophically solid. Logic, reason, and science, they lead us to believe that God does exist. Science and Christianity are friends of the same author we discovered last week. And finally, perhaps in this series, some of you have discovered that there are traditions that we may have grown up with that were not hermeneutically accurate or reflective of the global Christian community. And although sometimes this process can be uncomfortable, it's how we grow and mature in our faith. Then finally, the ultimate reason for studying Christian apologetics, which we addressed in our introduction, the ultimate reason for studying apologetics is to ignite faith in those who do not believe and to fan the flame in those who do. Last year, we looked at the historical reliability of the biblical text in our series on the biblical texts. And this is one of the key issues in apologetics, the historical reliability of the Bible. And in our current series, we looked at evidence for the existence of God, faith and science, and then today, looking at theodicy. There are many other issues within the sphere of apologetics, which I encourage you to delve into on your own with the resources provided. But today, we look at the most troubling issue of all, theodicy. What is a theodicy, you ask? A theodicy is an attempt to answer the question of why God permits evil and suffering if God is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. There are two approaches to this question. The first is the logical or philosophical approach. We saw that in Alvin Platinga's video. And this approach wrestles with reconciling the fact that both evil and an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God exists. Reconciling that issue on a philosophical, logical level. But then the second approach to theodicies is existential, referring to our day-to-day experience. This approach, it's pastoral in nature. It's focused more on an individual situation who is experiencing the pain, the confusion, the hurt, the disillusionment encountered when experiencing evil and suffering. And we find theodicy expressed in the Psalms. We find it expressed in the book of Job. During the offering, we had a look at one of Alvin Platinga's videos addressing the issue of evil. There is a follow-up video to that called Transworld Depravity, which I encourage you to watch on your own time later. But here's another video introducing the issue of theodicy by William Lane Craig from his website, reasonablefaith.org. This is William Lane Craig's video, Suffering and Evil, the Logical Problem, from his website, reasonablefaith.org. Video number 7.
We are all well aware of the suffering and evil in the world. Horrific suffering, unspeakable evil. How then can anyone believe in the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God? And if God does exist, why would anyone want to worship him? Epicurus framed the logical problem of suffering and evil like this. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, then he's not all-powerful. If he is able to prevent evil, but not willing, he is not good. But if he is both willing and able, how can evil exist? And if he is neither able nor willing, then why call him God? In other words, it's logically impossible for God and suffering to both exist. But we know full well that suffering exists. Therefore, God does not. Is this a good argument? Let's look at it more closely. Are these two statements logically inconsistent? No. Here is an example of two logical inconsistent statements. David can't be both married and a bachelor. But there is no explicit contradiction between these two statements. So there must be hidden assumptions behind this argument that would bring out the alleged contradiction. Here they are. If God is all-powerful, he can create any world he wants. And if God is all-loving, he prefers a world without suffering. So, if an all-powerful, all-loving God exists, it follows that suffering does not exist. Since suffering obviously does exist, the atheist concludes that God must not exist. But are the atheist's two hidden assumptions necessarily true? Consider the first assumption. Can God create any world he wants? What if he wants a world populated by people who have free will? It's logically impossible for God to force someone to freely choose to do good. Forcing free choices is like making a square circle. It's not logically possible. It's not that God lacks the power to perform the task. It's that the supposed task itself is just nonsense. So, it may not be feasible to create a world populated by people who always freely choose to do what is morally good. So the first assumption is not necessarily true. Therefore, the argument fails. And what about the second assumption? Is it necessarily true that God would prefer a world without suffering? How could we possibly know this? We all know of cases where we permit suffering in order to bring about a greater good. If it's even possible that God allows suffering in order to achieve a greater good, then we cannot say this assumption is necessarily true. For the logical problem of suffering to succeed, the atheist would have to show that it's logically impossible that free will exists, and that it's logically impossible that God has good reasons for permitting suffering. This burden of proof is too heavy to bear. It's quite possible that God and suffering both exist. This is why philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have given up on the logical problem of evil.
We can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. Some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of a theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. It's now acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt.
But this is hardly the end of the discussion. We still need to explore the probability version of the problem of evil.
Are you enjoying those videos so far? Good. It is easily seen that logically, to say God does not exist because there is evil and suffering in the world is not conclusive. On a logical level, we cannot say that there is no God in response to our suffering. But what about experientially? How many of us have asked the question, God, where are you in the midst of great pain? How many of us have questioned, God, don't you care when confusion over pain and hurt dominate our lives? Where is God when extreme injustices happen to us, or to those we love, or to the innocent? let us be very careful not to approach those in the midst of their pain with the logical answer to pain and suffering. For those in the midst of terrible suffering and pain, validation, not logic, is needed. It's okay to question God in the midst of our pain. It's okay to question God when we see unimaginable suffering in the world. In our series on the Psalms last year, we looked at the broad range of emotional expression found there. God has big shoulders, and no question or complaint is too hard or deep to launch at God. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is known as the Psalm of Despair. The psalm, it begins in despair and it ends in despair. The last line in Psalm 88 is, "You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend." That's the last line in Psalm 88. Darkness is my closest friend. How did it ever make it into the Psalms, you have to wonder? There is no happy ending. God doesn't swoop down at the last moment to save the day like a good Hollywood movie. It's one of my favorite Psalms because of its honesty. Sometimes there is no answer. Sometimes in the midst of our pain, no answer will suffice. We tend to give pithy little answers to people who suffer, often adding to their suffering. But this psalm gives us permission to pour out to God in honesty without candy coating or ignoring the depth of one's suffering. You see, God understands our suffering, for God experiences great suffering. God's not far off, but God walks among us. God is deeply engaged with us every day. And God partook in suffering on the cross, having been tortured, beaten, then executed in one of the most painful ways possible. But there was purpose in his suffering, to provide a way for us back to God. Now, this is not to say that all pain and suffering serves to draw us to God. For some, it drives them away from God. Many of you may recall the great Canadian evangelist Charles Templeton. After seeing a picture of a woman in Africa holding her dead baby on the cover of a Time magazine due to drought, he turned agnostic over the issue of pain and suffering. For some, pain drives them away from God. For others, it drives them to God. Were it not for my pain personally, were it not for my inability to control my circumstance, personally, I would not have come to know God. It was in the midst of my pain which drove me to ask Jesus for help. In that moment, not only was I healed, but I also experienced a love and a joy, a peace that was transcendent of anything experienced here on earth. It was something experienced which could not be generated on my own. This is a profound experience that penetrated the depths of my being, which I didn't even know was there. It was pain that drove me there. An experience, a change, a revealing done to me, not produced by me. It was a taste of a heavenly kingdom available in the here and now. And were it not for the pain that I was experiencing, I would not have come to a place of faith in Jesus Christ and discovered this otherworldly kingdom reality. Now, not everybody comes to God this way, but many do. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And when we discover those in the midst of great pain and suffering, let us approach them in love, in gentleness, and compassion. There is no easy answer to the problem of evil and suffering. For those in the midst of their pain, no answer is sufficient. And sometimes those moments call for a hand to be held, a shoulder to cry on, rather than words. Millard Erickson, in his systematic theology work, Christian Theology, recognizes the difficulty of this issue. He says in his section on Theodicy, says, we are dealing here with a problem that has occupied the attention of some of the greatest minds of the Christian church, intellects of such stature as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. None of them have been able to put the problem to rest finally and completely. We should therefore not be unduly depressed if we cannot settle the issue in some final fashion. Although we will not be able to resolve the problem, we may be able to alleviate it somewhat and to see the directions from which final solution might come had we more complete knowledge and understanding. The truth is, we have not seen the end. God is just and loving. God knows our pain. God is with us in our suffering. There is nothing that God cannot heal or overcome. And when encountering those going through pain, may we be sensitive to where they are in that moment. It may be their time of Psalm 88, a moment in which all they can see is despair. Offering a hand or arms to hold, a shoulder to lean and cry on, are more effective in such moments than words and logical answers to their pain. You see, the Psalms, they validate our experience of pain. They acknowledge the confusion and powerful question of why aimed at God. And God gives us permission to launch the most difficult questions of life at him, for he knows our situation. So we conclude with the second part of William Lane Craig's video on suffering and evil. Suffering and evil, the probability version.
In part 1, we looked at the logical version of the problem of suffering and evil. This argument attempts to show that since suffering and evil exist, it is logically impossible for God to exist. And we explained why even atheist philosophers admit that this argument fails. But wait, it may still be argued that while it's logically possible that God and suffering both exist, is far from likely. There's just so much pointless suffering, it seems improbable that God could have good reasons for permitting it. This is the probability version of the problem. Suffering provides empirical evidence that God's existence is not impossible, just highly unlikely. Is this a good argument? Consider 3 points. First, we are not in a position to say with any confidence that God probably lacks reasons for allowing the suffering in the world. The problem is that we're limited in space and time, and in intelligence and insight. God, on the other hand, sees every detail of history from beginning to end, and orders it through people's free decisions and actions. In order to achieve his purposes, God may have to allow a great deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears pointless within our limited scope of understanding may be seen to have been justly permitted by God within his wider framework. Sometimes, what we experience makes no sense until we gain a wider perspective and see the big picture designed by the Creator. Here's the second point. Relative to the full scope of the evidence, God's existence may well be probable. You see, probabilities are always relative to background information. For example, if we consider only how much this man weighs, we would say it's highly improbable that he's a world-class athlete. But when we're willing to consider new information, that he's a professional sumo wrestler and a world champion, we quickly revise our view. In the same way, when the atheist claims that God's existence is improbable, we should ask, improbable relative to what background information? If we consider only the suffering in the world, then God's existence may very well appear to be improbable. But if we're willing to look at the full scope of background information, to take into account the powerful arguments for God's existence, we may come to a very different conclusion. The third point is, Christianity entails doctrines that increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering. Consider 4 of these. First, the chief purpose of life is not happiness. People often assume that if God exists, his role is to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. They think the ultimate goal of our lives on earth is happiness, and therefore, God is obligated to keep us happy. However, Christianity presents a radically different view, that the purpose of life is to know God. This alone brings true, lasting fulfillment. Suffering can bring about a deeper, more intimate knowledge of God, either on the part of the one who is suffering or those around him. The whole point of human history is that God, having given us free will, is drawing as many people as he can into his unending kingdom. Suffering is one of the ways God can draw people freely to himself. In fact, countries that have endured the most hardship often show the highest growth rates for Christianity.
God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world.
Second, mankind is in a state of rebellion against God and his purpose. Terrible human evils are testimony to man's depravity, a consequence of his alienation from God. The Christian isn't surprised at moral evil in the world. On the contrary, he expects it. The third doctrine states that God's purpose is not restricted to this life, but spills over beyond the grave into eternal life. This world is just the beginning, the entryway to an unimaginable, never-ending life beyond death's door. Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, underwent afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, hunger. Yet he wrote, "We do not lose heart, for this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." Paul understood that life on earth and whatever suffering it holds for each of us is temporary. Our pain will not endure forever, but our lives with God will. Paul was not belittling the plight of those who suffer horribly in this life. Indeed, he was one of them. But he saw that those sufferings will be overwhelmed forever by the ocean of joy that God will give to those who will freely receive it. And the fourth doctrine is this: the knowledge of God is an incomparable good. Knowing God is the ultimate fulfillment of human existence, an infinite good. Thus, the person who knows God, no matter how much he has suffered, can still say, "God is good to me." So, if Christianity is true, it's not at all improbable that suffering and evil should exist. In summary, for all these reasons, the probability version of the problem of evil is no more successful than the logical version. As a purely intellectual problem, then, the problem of evil does not disprove God's existence. But even if those intellectual arguments fail, the emotional problem of suffering and evil remains very powerful. If you have suffered deeply, or if you've watched someone you love go through intense pain, you may be thinking, so what if God exists? Why would I want to respond to Him or worship Him? I feel cold and empty and want nothing to do with Him. You're not alone. God knows your name. He knows who you are and what you're going through. God promises to be with you through your suffering. He can give you the strength to endure. Jesus Christ also suffered. Although He was innocent, He was tortured and sentenced to death. His suffering had a purpose: to provide you and me with a life-giving connection to God. Not only does God exist, but He loves you. He seeks after you. He offers you hope. And in time, He will make all things new.
He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.